Welcome back, folks, to another episode of From the Vault, Ricky Rock's retro action figure review. I know it's been a while since we got together. I've been real busy, sorry about that, but I'm sure you have too. A lot going on in the world these days. To get back on track with something legitimately old school and not just old school inspired, I want to do something a little different today than what we usually done, and it's in response to some questions I've had over the last couple of years about the things that I do, the reviews and whatnot. A couple people have noticed and they said, gosh, it's not bad, but everything you do is like so positive and so over the top, with praise. Is there anything that you might look at that you're not a huge fan of, or something that maybe you don't like so much, or maybe you didn't when it was new and then something changed? And point of fact, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And what we're going to be looking at today, in case you couldn't guess, because I got the ring set up here, although we're not going to be looking at TNA figures, unfortunately. One day and one day soon. But today, on From the Vault, we're going to be looking at these effing things. Okay, I got a couple of these here. These are, of course, the Jakks WWF Superstars bone-crunching action figures. There was about 1.5 million of these over the years. This was from Series 3, so still really early in the line. As you can see, some of the different figures that came out in that set. We're going to be looking at 6 different figures today, so we got a lot to get through. But yeah, quick history lesson on the state of wrestling action figures, because I'm one of the guys who could give you more of the straight dope on that than anybody, because I'm older than wrestling figures. When I was born, wrestling action figures didn't even exist, so I've seen every line that's come out in this country since the early 80s, so it's none of your business how old I am, by the way, so don't ask. Anyway, so the Jakks WWF line started in early 1996. Mid-90s were kind of a dark time for wrestling action figures. Hasbro WWF were the standard from 1990 to 1994, but then wrestling took a huge dip in popularity right around that time, and Hasbro stopped support, or they let the license go for the WWF after Toys R Us stopped supporting the line, is essentially what happened. And for about a year and a half, there weren't any WWF figures. WCW was putting out their line by the original San Francisco Toy Makers Company, and those were kind of a mixed bag. They were doing like the big rubber statues like LJN used to do, no articulation, iffy likenesses, and things like that. So, like a lot of people, I picked them up because there was nothing else to get, but it's like, man, I wish there was a line of wrestling figures out there with arms and legs that moved, and I could actually wrestle with them instead of just kind of mash them around. That was weird. And then one day I'm at the flea market, me and my dad, and I turned the corner, and I saw this whole rack of Series 1 and 2 of the Jakks Pacific WWF Superstars line. And my initial reaction was like, oh, awesome. And then I looked at them a little closer. I was like, huh. Because they weren't fantastic. I mean, they weren't terrible. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth as we go on. But, there's a lot of things I wasn't a huge fan of. The lack of articulation, the faces being kind of iffy. I will say this, though. As much as I didn't like what Jakks' early output with wrestling figures was, by the time they hit the Ruthless Aggression style and the classic Superstars waves hit, they became, up to that point, my favorite wrestling action figures ever. So, all the credit in the world to Jakks for improving as they went along, all the way up until 2009 when they lost the WWE license. I still hate that. It's WWF to me, man. I'm sorry. And especially today, what we're going to be looking at was WWF A to the Z. So we got 6 figures to look at. They're either bone-crunching action or bone-crunching action inspired, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but it's generally a catch-all term for the scale of that particular kind of wrestling figure. So they weren't the best ever, but they do have some charm, and I've kind of come around on them since then. But at the time, I was like, nah, we'll talk about that. So we're going to be back in a minute, and we're going to go through 6 different figures, just a random assortment I picked up at, where else but Funkenstein Wrestling Superstore at the Englishtown Flea Market. That's where I get almost all of my wrestling figures, and that's where I picked these up. They have a great selection of every wrestling action figure line that's ever come out, from AWA to WWF to WCW to TNA Impact and everything in between. So check them out if you're in the area. They also have an eBay store, so there's really no excuse not to get your wrestling figures from them. So thank you to Funkenstein Wrestling Superstore for hooking me up with these WWF bone crunching action figures. We're going to be back in a minute, and we're going to start busting them open, and I'll show you exactly which ones we have. Stay tuned. First up, we have, of course, the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be, Bret the Hitman Hart. This is one of the standout figures from Series 3. He was just about hitting the peak of his tweener run, where he was not quite a heel yet, but kind of on the way there. Other superstars from this series included Ahmed Johnson, Sycho Sid, the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith, Mankind, and of course Bret Hart's arch nemesis, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. So we have here one of my favorites from this early series of figures, Bret the Hitman Hart. Gotta have Bret Hart in your collection, absolutely. Also from Series 3, we have Sycho Sid, or Sid Vicious, if you're an old goat like me. Sid was pretty much at the peak of his powers here. This was right around the time he was getting the biggest push of his career, which led to him main eventing WrestleMania against The Undertaker in one of the worst WrestleMania main events of all time. However, they did send the crowd home happy that night, so points for them for that. Match wasn't great, but point of fact, Sid was one of the most popular guys in the WWF at this point in time. This would have been mid-late 1996. So again, Sycho Sid, definitely a huge get for any WWF Superstars collection. Jumping ahead to Series 4, we have the one, the only Jerry the King Lawler. Other figures from Series 4, titled Bad Boys Collection, we had Farouk, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Justin, Hawk Bradshaw, Vader, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley. I wonder whatever happened to that guy. And again, this figure set focused mostly on the bad guys, or the heels, that were pretty dominant in the WWF right around this time. This is one of the last waves to come out before they switched the logo and the direction of the company towards the more attitude-focused endeavors. So this was pretty cool right here. As far as I'm aware, the first ever action figure of Jerry the King Lawler. If there was one made before this, somebody please let me know. Ain't he great? Jumping ahead to Superstars Series 6, we have the one and only JEFF, JARRETT, that's Double J, Jeff Jarrett. Other figures in this assortment included Mark Merrow, Triple H, Mark Henry, Owen Hart, and Steve Blackman. This is also one of the first ever figures for Jeff Jarrett. Once again, if there was ever a figure of him before this one, somebody please let me know, because I'm simply not aware of it. Jeff Jarrett, one of my all-time favorites. Gotta have Jeff Jarrett. I have several from many different lines, but this is the earliest one. Happy to add this one to the collection. Jumping ahead a little bit to 1998, we have the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels from Shotgun Saturday Night Series 2. This was around the time when the Superstars line was getting split off into multiple different series with different titles, where a lot of the same figures were re-released with new packaging, new accessories, things like that. Michaels was pretty much out of the game for a good long while by this point, so it was a little bit unusual to get a figure of him, especially in his ring attire. However, not a bad figure to add to the collection, and a little bit better in the face than some of the earlier figures that had come out, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And finally, another figure that I'm really glad to have in the collection, Brian freaking Pillman from Slammers Series 2. Now, the Slammers figures were not technically bone-crunching action figures because they didn't have the actual bone-crunching action. They were designed with action features where you move them around and they move their arms and stuff like that. But they used the same style, scale, and almost identical molds to the bone crunching action figures, so it's all kind of lumped together under the BCA banner, even though they're technically not bone crunchers. But what are you going to do, right? One of the few figures that they did release of Brian Pillman back then, released after he unfortunately and tragically passed away. Other figures from Slammer Series 2 included the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, Dude Love, Kane the Patriot, and Taka Michinoku. These were crazy times. Alright, so we're going to start with Bret. We're going to go in chronological order. Before we get too deep into it, yes, I know obviously this is not a WWF ring. This is actually a Jakks TNA ring, the Hulkamania ring to be specific. I have a million rings, but they're all kind of spread out, and some of them are boxed up. This is the closest one I could get to. Give me a break, alright? Don't bust my chops over it. I'm just making do with what I got at hand. You know, let's not overthink crap. So, we're going to jump in with Bret Hart from Series 3. And again, there was a lot of cool figures in Series 3. The first few waves of WWF Superstars had a lot of really iconic characters and figures, and for a lot of them, their first ever action figures came out in this line. Obviously, that's not true of Bret the Hitman Hart, but this was the first one of him in a large, or larger, I should say, 6-inch-ish scale. And I really have come to appreciate them more now, like I said, than I ever did as a kid. Yeah, we're going to pop this guy open, and we'll talk a little bit about what's inside. And one thing I will say I always loved these display bases, these very beautiful WWF display bases that a lot of these early figures came with. I understand why they got away from doing that later on, but if you ask me, if it was between a base or like a trash can or a folding chair or whatever, you know, I'd rather have the base, but that's just me. So we'll be back in a minute. We're going to pop this guy open and we're going to talk about it. There he is in all his glory, the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, Bret the Hitman Hart. Now, one of the first things I could say after taking him out of the package is thank goodness he comes with the display base, because this dude does not want to stand, and even with the base, his legs are warped to a position where without the base, you'd have to lean him on something. Even with the base, he's kind of wobbly. You see, I got him up on one foot, sort of, and, you know, got him balanced just right. I don't know, man. I don't think it has to do with how long it's been in the package. It's just the way these figures were constructed. But again, every BCA figure came with one of these cool display bases. You find these on eBay still in lots. They can go for a pretty decent... they're not too expensive, but I mean, they definitely make your collection pop. So if you don't have any of these and you're a fan of old school wrestling figures, I definitely recommend picking some up. They'll probably work just fine with some of your newer figures too. As for Bret himself, this guy here has very minimal articulation, as was the style at the time. Arms up and down. That's it. The good thing is they're not too snug or too loose generally. I mean, these guys are so simple that to this day, if you find these loose, as long as they weren't completely beat up, you can usually find them in pretty good condition with snug joints. The head, probably, nope, nothing going on with the head. Head doesn't move. Arms, legs, and waist. That's what you get. Waist swivel, side to side. Legs forward and back. Very simple. We didn't have a lot of articulation in wrestling figures back then. They didn't move a whole bunch. As you can see, no elbow or knee joints. But what you get in exchange for that is the fantastic, phenomenal, oh so well renowned and regarded bone crunching action that these figures were named for. If you've never seen it before, get a load of this. We're going to be real quiet, and we're going to get in real close, and if you're lucky, under a full moon on the 17th of St. Swithin's or whatever, you might just be able to actually hear the effect of what they were going for. You ready for this? Check it out. That's it. That's what you get. Bone crunching action. Wasn't that awesome? I will say, actually, this one This one actually seems to work a little better than some of the ones I've had in the past. That one was actually fairly audible. What I assume happens is like some air gets in there and escapes through those little holes in the rubber. Interesting. Like, you'll notice when you play with these that the body base is like a hard plastic and the arms and legs are much softer, pliable, to the point where you can even sort of move the fingers around like that. They're very rubbery. Yeah, so not too shabby as far as what they were going for. One of the things I really did not like about bone crunching action figures was the likenesses in general. The face sculpts, not terrific. If you go back to the WWF Hasbro figures from the early and mid 90s, the faces on those are still some of the best you'll ever see on any wrestling action figures ever made. And then you jump ahead 2-3 years to the Jakks figures, and it's a whole different game. They're not terrible, but I always like to joke that they looked like they were sculpted out of Play-Doh. Like, they're very caricaturized compared to the almost photorealistic face sculpts of the Hasbro figures, and then later some of the very figures that Jakks themselves would come to produce. But back then you had a much more simplified look to the figures. Bret here got off better than most of them did because they were able to cheat a little bit by giving him the sunglasses, so right there you have less to worry about in trying to recreate his face. You know, the hair, not too bad, good length. You know, they pretty much got as good as they could for what they were going for. I don't really have any complaints there. The outfit, a pretty perfect recreation of Bret's outfit, right down to the lettering on the tights, the hearts on the leg. All the little details are there. They're not as sharp as they would become over the years with many other Bret Hart figures, but it's all there. I mean, at a glance, it's fantastic. But there's little things that add up, like I said, primarily the leg issue here. I do have more of these sitting in a box somewhere. I remember always being a little frustrated with these guys because they don't like to stand. But, I mean, they got around that by offering you the base. Overall, though, I mean, you could work with it, you could play with it. It's not a bad figure by any means. They did re-release this figure and, variations of this figure many times in many packages before he ended up leaving for WCW in late 97. So, not a hard figure to find or get your hands on. As a kid, I had the Slammers variant, which was almost identical to this figure, except it had a little peg on the back to make his arms go up and down. So, pretty cool. I'm very glad I got it, as I said, even though by no means is it a perfect figure. But if you don't have one, whether you collect vintage WWF or even just Bret Hart specifically, great figure to add to your collection. So, even though I'm not overwhelmingly in love, I definitely like the figure. I'm very glad to finally have one. This is one I never had as a kid. This is the very first one from the actual BCA line that I got. So, big thumbs up, even though, like everything else in life, not perfect. Ultimately, aside from maybe having a little bit better likeness, the only thing I would really change about this figure is pretty minor, but if it were up to me, I would make the wrist tape detailing a little bit thicker. Like that, it's basically just a little teeny line. It's not sculpted on even, it's just painted. They just painted a pink line around his wrist. Kind of cheesy. Doesn't even look like wrist tape or a wrist band. It just looks like a pink, it looks like he's got a rubber band on his wrist. So, nah, that could have been done better. Everything else, though, pretty good. Up next, we're going to be looking at Sycho Sid, spelled with an S for trademark purposes, and that always killed me as a kid. I mean, spelling was one of my things, you know, and like, that's not how you spell that. But anyway, so another Series 3 figure, you could tell. I didn't have the ring either. The ring you may or may not know, was actually a reissue of the old LJN Sling 'em Fling 'em WWF ring, just with new stickers and corner posts, and that's the ring that I refurbished a few videos back. You might remember my WWF LJN ring restoration, so check that video out if you haven't. That was also part of this line, and it was kind of weird because the ring was like 5 times bigger than it needed to be for these kind of figures. But so, Sycho Sid coming up next. Let's pop them open and see what we got. Alright, Sycho Sid, fresh out of the box. And pretty good figure, as you can see from the likeness. This actually, I think, was one of the better head sculpts of the early bone-crunching action figures. It's not perfect. He definitely looks pretty surprised. That's probably the same look he had on his face when, Pillman came at him with the squeegee. But that's a whole other story. Still not bad, not as great as the likeness on the Sid Justice figure from Hasbro, or the classic Superstars figure that Jakks themselves would put out about 10 years after this. But for 96, this was not too shabby. The body looks good. One thing I can't help but notice is that he's quite tan compared to all the other figures in the line, which is a nice little touch. He definitely was always pretty tan, Sycho Sid, and it's the little touches like that that I always appreciate from an action figure. So one thing, again, without the stand, this guy probably wouldn't stand too well. You can see he's kind of hunched to one side, with one leg being more bent than the other. And that's just... A lot of the Jakks lines had little legacy issues that would pop up where, because they reused parts so much, if there was an issue, like, say for example, legs being different length, they would just show up in every figure forevermore, and they would not fix it, because I guess it was cheaper to not fix it. I don't know. Just drove me nuts then. Kind of drives me nuts now. Out of the package, the right leg really loose. Not like to the point where you'd be worried about breaking it or anything. It's just weird because the other joints are really snug. Really snug. Not to the point where you feel like you're going to break it, but like this one feels like it's greased up compared to this guy. This guy, like, again, the waist would rather go than the leg. It's just weird. But, altogether not bad. Just, again, because of the stupid leg issue with these things, man. Like I said, these things bugged me as a kid. They still bother me now. But at the end of the day, they're just toys. These were not marketed for collectors. They were for kids to play with. And as kids' toys, they were adequate. Everybody I knew had at least some of these. And Sid here was one of the most popular figures in those early waves. The most people I knew had a Sid. He wasn't hard to find, and he was really popular, so a lot of people picked him up. I never did, for whatever reason. Again, I was not collecting these specific figures at the time because they were very iffy to me. Ultimately, out of all the Sid Vicious figures that have ever been made, from WCW Galoob being the first, all the way up to the newer Mattel ones, by default, I'd have to say this is the worst Sid figure, if you're going to have one labeled the worst, because pretty much every other figure of him that's ever been made had a better looking head, and could stand better. But, still not terrible. I mean, it's fine, I don't dislike it. I just didn't like it enough as a kid to pick it up. But I'm glad I have it now. One advantage this Sid figure has over the Bret Hart figure, you can actually move the head. So this one has one extra point of articulation over the Bret Hart figure. Also, the wrist tape doesn't look like a little skinny line either, so that's pretty awesome. Again, they did tend to get better with these things as they went along. The bone crunching action itself, again, not too bad, but like you can't even hear it at all on the legs. One thing, if you never played with one of these before, do not ever try to go side to side with these things, because you'll snap it right off. They're only made to go front to back, and even then, barely. I never really liked to mess with them as a kid. Bottom line, for me, it was an interesting gimmick, but I could have done without it. Hail to the king, baby! It's Jerry the King Lawler! Once again, as far as I'm aware, this was the first ever action figure of Jerry the King Lawler, who'd already had himself quite a long and prestigious career by the time this figure was made. And again, on the back you see some of the other lines that were coming out right around the same time. They branched out into doing 2-packs and box sets, and one of the great things about the WWF Superstars line from Jakks was that it was really easy to build a collection very quickly because of all the ways they would reissue and repackage figures. You could pick up just a couple different sets and you could have yourself like 20 figures in a couple of days. So that was always really cool. Again, as a kid, even though I didn't collect these, I was excited to see Jerry the King finally get an action figure because not one of my all-time favorite wrestlers as a kid, but I really respected him and I used to read about him in the After mags, and growing up in Jersey, I never got to see him wrestle until that garbage they would do on WWF TV, which was bleh. But still, he got a figure and it's not too bad. Let's pop it open and check it out. Before I forget, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about really briefly regarding this wave of Superstars. Now, Wave 4 was called the Bad Boys series, and as you can see, it was all heels that were getting a lot of TV time on WWF television right around that point in time. And you know, it's really interesting. It was a daring thing to do on the part of Jakks to put out an entire wave of bad guys. That had never been done before. But also, if you look back on it historically, it really does kind of foreshadow the new Attitude Era that was just over the horizon, that was going to overtake the WWF about a year after this. We were already starting to see the so-called bad guys becoming as popular or more popular than the good guys. So, it was interesting to see that they acknowledged that by putting out an entire wave that was just bad guys. Pretty interesting stuff. Here he is in all his majesty, Jerry the King Lawler. Now I have to say, this figure actually impresses me a little bit more than some of the others. For example, if you take a look, the leg issue is mostly fixed. Not every piece was always reused between a bone-crunching action figure. This one has different legs, and as such, the right leg is not quite so bent. The figure stands up just fine without the base, so that was pretty interesting. The arms and legs move pretty well, and this was notable for being one of the very first WWF bone-crunching action figures to include an accessory. Some of them had them, some of them didn't, but he was one of the first, and of course, you can't have Jerry the King without his crown. The removable crown was an awesome touch. I love that. Again, not a bad figure overall compared to some of the other ones in the line at the time. I honestly have to say this was one of the better ones. The face sculpt is not bad at all. It's pretty close of a likeness. It's a soft sculpt, but it doesn't look bad. It almost resembles his son, the late great Brian Christopher, which is, again, not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because, you know, they bear a lot of resemblance. But, you know, it looks almost like a younger Jerry Lawler, which was cool, but it's recognizable as him, which you couldn't always say about some of these BCA figures. They got all the little details right. They actually sculpted wristbands on, which was cool. They didn't have to do that, but they did, and I really appreciate that. The coloring of the paint is a nice match for what he actually wore. They got the crowns on the tights and the boots, which is fantastic. Really, really like this figure all the way around, front to back. Again, nothing fancy. These figures were really, really basic, but even as basic figures go, I think this was one of the better ones. Really no complaints, other than he kind of pops on and off the stand a little too easily. But, you know, arms and legs move just fine. The bone-crunching action feature you know, it's hit or miss with almost every one of these figures. You either get a little soft pop or you get nothing. So, it is what it is. He's definitely not worn out because he's fresh out of the box. But, yeah, overall, pretty impressed with this figure, actually. I was not expecting them to do such a good job with all the little details. Even the sculpting on the crown. I mean, you know, the sculpting of the detailing and the different colored jewels and so forth. I mean, they could be a little bit brighter, but overall, you know, it's a pretty good job for a company like Jakks, which was even back then kind of notorious for cutting corners. And it's a really soft rubber, so it pops right on the head very easily and comes right off just as well. So, yeah, A+ for this Jerry Lawler. It's about as good as you can do between the limitations of what this line had. So, I'm really happy with this one. Jumping ahead to Series 6, we've got Double J Jeff Jarrett, and again, what I'm pretty sure was his first ever action figure. Now, let's take a look. This is definitely his Double J gimmick. The country singer version, which, you know, wasn't a huge fan of. A little too over the top for me. Again, I grew up reading about Jeff down in Memphis, and I was familiar with his work before I saw him on WWF TV. So again, like a lot of the guys, he sort of became a caricature. But still, happy to have a figure of him in the line. As you can see, once again, by this point, they were branching out the Superstars line into 2 packs, and the very cool ringside collection, guys like the Honky Tonk Man, Jim Ross, Vince McMahon. Was not super common back then to get a lot of figures of guys unless they were wrestlers. So in this case, they did a whole wave, a couple waves I think, dedicated just to announcers, managers, ringside people. That was pretty neat to see. And of course, Grapple Gear actually selling you packets of accessories, which was something that no wrestling figure line had really done up to that point. Occasionally you get an accessory package with a figure, but being able to buy the accessories separate was pretty cool as well. So Jakks was branching out by this point, and as you can see by looking at the revamped logo, the Attitude Era was in full effect by this point, with the updated much crappier scratch logo. I'm a fan of the old, you know, iconic block WWF logo. It just looked cleaner and less like something a third grader did in art class. But, you know, it's just me. It's not like I have a WWF bias or anything. Yes, I do. You know, but it was a little weird to get this version of a Jeff Jarrett in an Attitude branded figure line, but hey, them's the breaks. Let's see what's up. There he is, Double J Jeff Jarrett in all his splendor. I gotta be honest, I kind of got a lot of love-hate with this figure. There's parts of it I really like, parts of it I really don't. It's definitely a good attempt. I mean, they did really do a strong effort on this Jeff Jarrett figure. It's just some of the choices they made, part of it the style of the figure, and part of it just the execution. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I will say more positive than negative, but I mean, there's things I would have preferred they either did differently or didn't do at all. Does do a great job of recreating his outfit with his goofy suspenders. I never understood it, but I mean, I liked it because nobody else did it. I was never a huge fan when he would do the multicolored attire with that. I always liked the basic white and gold or silver. Those were cool. They made it a point to include his trademark 2-finger point on both hands. That's pretty neat as well. Again, they didn't have to go that far with it. Sculpted wristbands again. As you can see, we're up to Series 6 now. In the early series, a guy like Bret Hart couldn't even get wrist tape sculpted on his arms. They just painted a little thing on his arm. Here we're actually getting wristbands, and the wristbands have decoration on them. That's cool as well. Jeff himself, the bonuses you get with this figure, you get the removable hat with the Double J logo, and it's not too bad, except it doesn't really fit on his head that well because of the hair. Comes off really easily, which your mileage will vary about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And again, you have his ridiculous, stupid glasses that I hate, never liked them, never will. I think they look stupid, but he did dress like that when he was in the WWF. He wore them during his entrance, so it's cool that they included them on the figure. However, they are removable, but there's good and bad to that. The bad is, the good, I should say. The good is that if you're like me and you hate the sunglasses, you can just take them off very easily, and that's actually cool too, because this was, I think, the first wrestling figure to have removable sunglasses. The downside is, if you do take them off, you're stuck with these gigantic holes in his hair that you really can't do much about. They're there. So if you display him without the hat or the glasses, you're kind of left with them looking weird. So that's something I think I appreciate what they did, but it could have been better. They later did revisit this gimmick. I know Mattel does this same thing a lot nowadays with characters who wore sunglasses. They make them removable and they have the little holes in the hairline, but it's a little bit less conspicuous. So again, we've come a long way since then, but I do have to give credit for Jakks experimenting with this figure line and doing some things that were a little bit outside the box that you didn't ordinarily see. The sculpting on the hair is really cool too. I gotta give credit where it's due with that. Like, they were getting really detailed with hair at this point in time, so pretty good stuff there. Can't really complain. Again, I just hate the big holes in the front, but you win some, you lose some, right? And again, facial likeness, you can see they're getting a little bit closer to the wrestler as time goes on. This is actually not a bad likeness of Jeff, and way more accurate than the heads that Jakks would use on his later figures after he cut his hair and changed his gimmick up. This figure would have come out before he jumped to WCW for a year. So again, it was weird timing to get this figure at all, let alone in this gimmick. But this was before the haircut and everything else. This was pre-WCW, pre-Attitude Jeff Jarrett. So again, you can see how the timeline was a little bit in flux with regard to some of these wrestlers, some of these characters. But again, I always passed this guy up as a kid. Glad to finally have him now, even though there are some things that are not perfect and things that I wish they had done differently. But hey, them's the breaks. Overall, though, I do like it. Alright, now we're going to jump ahead to one of the side series. It was not Superstars, it was Shotgun Saturday Night. And right here we have the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. For those of you who weren't around back then, Shotgun Saturday Night was a show that WWF produced in the mid-90s. Very briefly, it was on real late on Saturday nights, obviously, and they would come from weird little venues like the Subway or, at a bar or wherever. They were just trying to present themselves as a little bit more gritty and unpredictable, a little bit more like ECW light in those days. They weren't quite in the Attitude Era yet, but they were kind of getting there. So, didn't really work. Nobody really watched the show. It was only available in very limited markets, but it was around long enough to get its own line of figures named after it, as you can see right here. So, this is one of the Shawn Michaels from that series, and over here, if you look on the back, we have some of the other side lines that were coming out, including Too Tough, which is some of their 2-packs. As you can see, more and more of the figures were coming out with accessories and weapons and things like that, so that's pretty cool too. I never had a great use for them as a kid, but I mean, when you're doing displays and dioramas and stuff like that, it's pretty cool to have. But yeah, so this line had a few figures in that vein as well. As you can see, Michaels comes with a few. So we're going to pop this guy open, mess around with him a little bit, and see just how he holds up to some of the other ones we've already looked at. Alright, Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. Now, this is, once again, this is technically not a bone-crunching action figure, but it kind of is. What this one is I talked a little bit earlier about the Slammers figures, and that's what this one is. These were figures that were in the same size as the bone crunching action figures, and they still had the same rubbery legs. But I'm telling you, most of these things, this one's technically not a BCA, but it's still got the same gimmick inside. But yeah, you can't hear it most of the time. Different arms, hard plastic arms without the action inside of them. That's fine. A little tab on the back for moving the figure like that. Pretty cool. Everybody had different features. Some of them would do things like that. Some of them, their arms would swing up and down. There wasn't a whole lot you could do with it practically. From a practical standpoint, it was kind of useless, but it was neat. I mean, toys are made to be played with, right? So Toy Biz would pick up the same basic idea with their WCW line about a year after this and do it way, way, way better. But somebody's got to be first, right? So this is Shawn Michaels in his entrance gear to go with his blue outfit. He was not part of the roster by the time this figure came out. He was already retired due to his back injury. So again, a little strange that we got this figure at all. But I do consider it a minor improvement of sorts over the first couple figures they did of Shawn Michaels, where I wasn't a big fan of the head sculpt. They got the outfits really perfect, but the original face kind of looked like he was trying to slide off his head. I never liked it. I think this face is a much better likeness for Shawn Michaels. He's got that kind of sarcastic expression, especially this time of his career. He was pretty much constantly in a sour mood, and he looks it here. He looks like he's pretty disgusted and ready to fight somebody. I like the hair a lot. I like the length and the sculpting on the hair. Pretty cool. Again, they were definitely getting better with things like this as it went on. It's interesting to have him in his entrance gear because that's not a thing that they did a lot of back then for various figures. You either had just wrestling gear or they'd have full entrance stuff. I mean, this is just his chaps without his jacket or anything. I don't remember him ever wearing solid black wristbands unless he had gloves as well, so but that's not a big deal. I do like the deco on the chaps. Very accurate, very close to what he wore. They did cheap out with the tights, though. They put the logo on the front, but nothing on the back. So that's a little iffy. The boots, no sculpting, but they did paint the details. So he had that silver flap over on his boots. So pretty cool. Overall, I like the figure, even though it's not really perfect, and like most of them, doesn't stand up too great unless you kind of mess with it. But I do, as you can see, you can figure it out. Doesn't come with a stand to help you with that, but it still has the hole in the foot if you want to use a stand. If you have a spare one floating around, you can do that. So not a bad figure. I could do without the action features 100% and have a more posable figure, but it is what it is. What you do get instead of a stand is you get some weapons to come with them. You get the trash can with the removable lid, and you get a little chain. These same exact accessories were repacked with like 100 Jakks figures. They were still putting the same stuff in with figures 10 years after these. This came out in like 98, and there were figures coming out in 2008 that had the same trash can, the same chain. I mean, I don't know why he comes with these. He'd never done matches or been involved in skits where he used these specific weapons. But Jakks, it never seemed to matter with them. If they had spare weapons floating around, they'd throw them in a box, and it didn't matter who you bought. You'd get these little extra tchotchkes to come with your figures. It is what it is. Hey, you know, it's better than nothing. If I had to swap it for anything, I would have had him come with like a little vest and or an entrance stand, but not too bad. One of the better Shawn Michaels figures that they put out back then. Got to give him credit for that. Things could have been better, but overall, thumbs up. Before I forget, one more thing I wanted to talk about real quick to illustrate just how good Jakks was when they wanted to be at getting some of the smaller details right, is the sculpted chest hair on this figure. Kind of hard to see because they didn't paint it or anything, but there's definitely texture there, and it's an extra little touch that they didn't always do, but I always appreciated when they did. That's pretty cool. Not even necessary, but I like that they made the effort. Last but definitely not least, one of my very favorite wrestlers of all time, and one who has been criminally underexposed in action figure form, Brian Pillman, the loose cannon himself. This was one of only 2 specific figures that WWF put out of Pillman at this time. Disappointing, but it was great to finally get my hands on him. Big fan, even though the figure itself is not perfect. We're going to flip it around on the back here. You're going to see some of the other figures, not just in the Slammers 2 line, but some of the other series that were out, such as Stomp, and, you know, they were doing a lot. They were branching out into a lot of sublines at this time, and I got to give them credit. Most of it was stuff that I didn't want and never bought, but I liked that they were willing to get creative with their products, so that's pretty cool to see. And in this same series, Slammers 2, you could see a repainted version of the Shawn Michaels figure that we just looked at. The figure I showed you was in blue, this one is in red, otherwise exact same figure. So that's kind of interesting, but that's in the rearview mirror. Right now we're talking about Brian freaking Pillman. So we're going to pop him out of the box, and this is going to be the last figure we look at today. Let's see how he holds up to the others. Alright, here he is, Brian Pillman, the loose cannon, or the time bomb, as WWF tried to rebrand him as. That didn't really take. But here he is. This was the second figure that they released of Pillman. The first was in the Stomp series, which was just a regular bone cruncher, and this one here is a Slammers figure. It has an action feature. They had the same head sculpt, same basic look. This one is a little bit more detailed, a little bit more accurate to what Pillman looked like at the time. So one thing I want to point out, we'll go A to Z, top to bottom. The head is pretty good. It's not perfect, like none of them are. It's not a really strong likeness, but at a glance, you can pretty much tell who it's supposed to be. Jakks, as I mentioned, at this period, they were getting better at sculpting. The likenesses were not necessarily as soft, but they were still not really too close much of the time to who they were supposed to be. You know this is Pillman because of the rest of the figure and what it looks like, but I mean, it's not really all that great, but I don't hate it. I mean, it's just, they definitely could have done a little bit better. But the hair sculpting also not bad, really good actually. His hair at this point was a little darker, so I would have maybe done a little bit darker shade. Facial hair, definitely. His goatee, I would have sculpted a little bit darker. But, you know, it is what it is. The other figure actually did have darker hair and a darker goatee, so that's kind of interesting. As I mentioned, this is a Slammers figure, so it is the action feature on the back. Different one than the Shawn Michaels figure we looked at. This one has a swing arm. We can kind of chop like that. Again, I give him points for thinking, but a lot of the action features really didn't fit the guys they gave them to. It was just something to get a little bit more playability out of the figure, and that's fine. I give them credit for what they did. It's just some guys maybe they could have done a little bit differently. The body sculpt, they were making guys jacked at this period in time. Just for the point of comparison, I'm going to go back to the earlier figure I showed you of Sycho Sid. Now, scale-wise, this is actually pretty good. No, I'm not just showing them together because of the infamous squeegee incident. That's ancient history. I'm not going back to revisit that again. I just want to show you, you can see how things were changing as the line went on. The leg issue by this point has mostly been fixed. Guys don't have that weird right leg that makes you stand them funny anymore. And the body sculpting, especially. It kind of looks like it ought to be reversed, right? Like, Sid would have been this jacked. Pillman maybe, but I don't know. But hey, I like that they were moving things forward, even on the back. With the gimmick in the way, it's kind of hard, but you could still see the sculpting. They really came a long way with their body sculpting as time went on. Really cool, and that was one of the more frustrating things about this line, though, is that putting newer figures next to older figures in the same line was kind of weird, because you'd start to see those little discrepancies as things improved and time went on. But overall, really cool Pillman figure, one of only 2 that Jakks did at that time. They later did several in the Classic Superstars series. One of my pet peeves, though, one of my little nitpicks, it's actually a pretty big deal. They did go to the trouble of getting the tights reasonably accurate. They even put that weird red flap on the crotch area that he wore during that period. And they did put his logo on both legs, but if you know what you're looking at, I like that they put the decoration on his tights, but the fact of the matter is, they put it on backwards for some reason. On both legs, they have it facing the opposite way, and that's weird. The other Pillman figure, to my knowledge, it's in a box, I can't get to it right now, but the Stomp figure had no logo on the tights, so I was excited to see that this one did, but then to have it backwards was a little disappointing. You're going to need to really look close at this one, but if you look at that right there, if you're able to tell on the picture of him in the figure, if you really, really squint on the prototype, it shows the logo facing the correct way. So I don't know what the hell happened here. I don't know why they would put it out backwards, unless they were working from a mirrored photograph or something. Sloppy shop, Jakks. Sloppy shop. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But at least they put the logo on there. I'm happy about that. And fact of the matter being, it's still a good figure. I like it a lot. It's definitely not perfect, but again, the little things. Sculpted wristbands instead of just being painted on. Logos on the tights. Better hair and body sculpting. They were definitely finding their stride by this point in 1998, and they would only continue to improve from here. I mean, the BCA-Style of figures was pretty much phased out by 1999. They kind of hung in there for a couple of years after that, but for the most part, after 99, they switched over to Titantron Live and Real Scan and so many other series of Jakks figures. But right here, this kind of is one of the better examples of how good they got with these figures as they went along. I do have to give Jakks credit as a company. For as weak as I thought their early figures were, they did improve over and over and over again, year to year to year, despite the fact they were still reusing parts, and nothing they did was ever, at that time, picture perfect with the guys they were trying to recreate. They still were not content to just rest on their laurels, and they always tried to do a little bit better every time out. So I got to give Jakks credit for that. You know, it takes a lot of work to make those kind of improvements, and some companies did it better than others, but they definitely started getting a lot better as time went on, and I think this figure is a really good example of that, despite some of the things that could have been better. There we have it. Bret Hart, Sycho Sid, Jerry the King Lawler, Double J Jeff Jarrett, the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, and Brian freaking Pillman. WWF bone-crunching action figures. You know, like I said, not my favorite line of WWF figures of all time, but definitely a big part of wrestling history. Gotta give credit where credit is due. Without this line, we wouldn't have had so much of what came after, like the Titantron Live series, the R3 series, or, of course, the Classic Superstars and Ruthless Aggression series. They definitely got better as they went along, and they're definitely a lot of fun to revisit, look at, mess around with, and they're a big part of wrestling history. So even though they're not my favorite, even now, I've learned to really appreciate them more now than I ever did then, simply for nostalgic value and the place they have in the history of professional wrestling and pro wrestling action figures. Well, that about does it for this episode of From the Vault, Ricky Rock's retro action figure review. Today we looked at just a random assortment of WWF bone-crunching action figures. I do have more, and I am going to be getting more, so from time to time we're going to revisit that line. And as I've talked about before, I have so many figures from so many different wrestling lines that we got a lot to talk about. But that's going to just about cover it for today, and I'm really glad to have you guys with me for these little trips down memory lane. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, do what you do, and hopefully as time goes on we'll be able to put out more and more of these for you and not have so many large gaps in between. That's going to do it. Thanks again for sticking with us on From the Vault. I'm Ricky Rocks. We're going to be catching you next time.